too nice last time, putting Limbo at C-. Limbo should very firmly be a D-rank Warframe.
And now onto Limbo. Yeah, they're just better frames than he is.
Limbo. Oh, a lot of people, yeah. Limbo, Ureli, Lavos, Loki, Vauban. I get that. These are a lot of Warframes that aren't popular and that a lot of people like argue on if they're good or bad and have like one or two things they're really good at. And then other than that, it's like, I don't like Lavos. I don't like Limbo. I don't like any of these Warframes a ton other than maybe Vauban. So I get it.
As a fellow creator, I'm disappointed in you all. Banishing Limbo for grievances, leading to a community in stasis. I have had enough. You've taken these grievances, although understandable, and surged a disdain of unimaginable proportions, plaguing the player base with short-sighted thinking and lacking all due diligence. And I will present to you how cataclysmic your mistake is! You know, for a guy who gets called the Limbo guy, it's been quite a while since I discussed Limbo by himself. No weapons, not individual mechanics in a 5-minute video this time. Today, I intend to unleash my knowledge to you all. A Limbo Bible to stand the tests of time. As cringy as that may sound. But first, let me introduce myself to those unfamiliar to my work. I am Sci-Fi Freak, a small but hopefully entertaining creator in Warframe dedicated to educating everyone on the things I know and have learned through my 2 years experience in Warframe. I have over 3,000 hours in this world, with over 1,000 hours dedicated to understanding the one who dances between realms. I have witnessed the rise of Narmer, the beautiful intricacies of Deviri, and the fall of Warframe mechanics entirely, due to the uneducated nature of Warframe's player base and its quote-unquote pioneers in the space. But anyway, let's get a move on and discuss our dapper friend here, who mathed himself out of existence. Yeah, that's not a joke. Limbo is a character in Warframe that has a long and turbulent history throughout his nearly 10 years of existence, where from his release, he was touted as a troll frame and only useful for causing chaos. And over the years, with the game's evolution, and changes in mission types and new tools, he has grown to be either hated by the general player base or forgotten entirely, with the only mention of his existence coming from the biggest Warframe personalities, who create videos catered for a generally lazy audience. And let me be clear here, my anger and disappointment towards these information-deprived abominations they call guides and or reviews is not due to bias. Yes, Limbo is my favorite frame, but he is undeniably flawed and has issues. He is not perfect. And if you think he is bad, that is your opinion. We all have to have opinions these days. That's okay with me. What grinds my gears is how these creators tend to only look at the flaws in Limbo's kit and almost none of his strengths. This being fueled by a meta-focused perspective, leading to a frame not judged on its own merits, with a clear lack of care in providing accurate displays of Limbo's functions and positive aspects, shown by a lack of elaboration.
Damage. You can actually remove her first ability and still be useful in farming situations. She has access to her own companion, and this companion can put on other mods So you can spread out your companion loadouts, one to buff your shields and one to buff your damage. And now onto Limbo. Yeah, they're just better frames than he is.
Warframe 2024 tier list as set up by Reddit. Look, Limbo's like can be really troll. Loki's just good for invisibility for me. It's like, okay. Note, Saren had the least statistical spread. Yeah, she did.
Multiplier. This is the same damage slot as Serration, and that will include, very importantly, your primary merciless and really all of your primary and secondary arcanes. Because the strength, I think, is doing the least work here. You definitely want a certain size of Cataclysm to make that worthwhile. Though, if you are doing like a mobile defense or something with Limbo, the lower range might be better, and you might even take Stretch out to get go into the Rift, turn time off in the Rift, and then open the Rift.
What do you mean by opening the Rift? You're already in it! Now, there have been several legendary creators who have properly discussed Limbo in the past, the most notable of these being close friends of mine, Nova Umbral and Triburos, with Triburos in particular being the one who inspired me the main Limbo. So when the time comes where I play my hand, just remember that this is mainly out of disdain for the creator properly discussing the subjects at hand. These creators have done good within the community, but it's mainly here that I believe that they are very uneducated and do not deserve the spotlight. Now, with that out of the way, let us discuss Limbo in a mechanical sense, and the magic that is the Rift. Limbo's Rift from its very inception and release has been very polarizing to those both familiar and unfamiliar with his work. May it be from the days of stopping bullets in midair for himself and allies, to what we have now with weapons like the Zymos and grouping tools like the Nautilus. Something that is both nowhere and everywhere that many people get wrong about. The Rift in a nutshell is a status effect that Limbo applies to enemies and objects around him through 3 of his 4 powers, those being Banish, Rift Surge, and Cataclysm. This also includes himself with his passive. In this state, nothing from the physical world can interact with Limbo, making himself effectively immortal. But the same is true with Limbo, making enemies themselves effectively immortal until Limbo can get them in his dimension. Now the Rift has 2 identifiers that tell whether or not allies or the Limbo are in the Rift or not. The first is this yellowish hue effect that consumes the world, and the second is that all drops that happen in or outside of the Rift will cling to you, and you can only collect these upon exiting the Rift or entering a Cataclysm bubble. If you want to disable these settings, simply go into the settings and disable color correction. With enemies, it is a completely different story, where they gain a shimmer effect around their feet that indicates they are now in the Rift plane. With all of the different on-screen effects Warframe has today, this is the part of Limbo's kit that becomes the most annoying. It is these VFX issues, as well as how the Rift mechanically functions, that people generally hate, because it creates 2 points of friction in its design. First, he can't just kill enemies outright and has to rely on his dimension for protection, making Limbo's fall under a gameplay style of, okay, I'm immortal, how do I kill things? While nearly every other frame falls under, okay, I can kill things, how do I stay alive? The second point of friction is for allies, where whenever Limbo is in a squad, they are forced to play around Limbo and his rules, where if they want to kill an enemy, they have to ask the Limbo for access to the Rift depending on the kind of Limbo build they are contending with. Now, over the years, they have reduced this issue significantly by allowing allied powers to bypass the Rift barrier, the most notable of them being frames like Mesa. But by this logic, enemies can do this in the form of enemy Eximus units. Now, I will discuss both of these aspects further in later segments, but keep these elements in the back of your head for now. In addition to what is effectively Mesmer Skin at home, Limbo and allies get 2 energy per second while in his dimension, and any enemies that are slain by allies or Limbo in the Rift give Limbo 10 energy per enemy killed. This allows Limbo to have an energy upkeep unlike any other frame, with the only frames being able to compete with him being Trinity or Grendel, with energy Vampire and Nourish respectively. And with the kit Limbo has in store, it makes this one of Limbo's greatest aspects, for he never has to worry about being powerless out on the battlefield. Now, with his passive out of the way, let us begin with his first power, Rift Walk. Wait, don't you mean Banish? No, Rift Walk, the other half of his passive, which is a whole ability in of itself. Rift Walk allows Limbo to enter and exit the Rift Dimension at will, leaving behind a small tear in reality that allies, enemies, and Limbo himself can utilize to traverse the planes of existence. This portal lasts for 5 seconds, and is unfortunately not affected by any mods you equip on the Limbo. This Banish created by the portal is unique to the others in this kit for a few reasons. The Banish for allies is capped at 10 seconds, while the Banish for enemies is capped at 15 seconds. And allies can only leave early via rolling, similar to the regular Banish. However, enemies that enter can only exit the rift by manually banishing them or letting the timer on them run out. Hold casting Banish does not remove them from the rift as normal. This is an interesting tool in this kit, for it can allow the user to get enemies into the rift for free, and when combined with playstyles I will mention later on, can make it easier to get Limbo's loop going in all mission types, making Rift Walk a core piece of Limbo's design despite some of the headaches it may cause for the user or allies. Now, there is one mechanic in Warframe's gameplay that is able to remove Limbo from his rift and is entirely out of Limbo's control unless you know what you're doing, and that is the nullifier. Now, the nullifiers are a very touchy subject in the game as well, but suffice to say, I don't think the nullifiers are as big of an issue as some people claim, and I will explain why later in future builds, but just know that this is the only other method that is outside of Limbo's control when it comes to removing him from the rift plane. So, with Rift Walk explained, let us move on to what I would consider Limbo's most important ability next to Rift Surge. Banish. Regular Banish is the one ability in Limbo's kit that is constantly overlooked for its sheer utility and mechanical functionality. Banish is a simple ability that upon casting for 25 energy unleashes an invisible radial cone in front of Limbo that will put any targets in front of him into the rift. These targets will remain in the rift for 25 seconds or until the Limbo releases the enemies via either casting the Banish on the target again or holding down the Banish button to release all the enemies from the rift simultaneously. The cone has a casting angle of 15 degrees and a range of 35 meters at base. This ability also applies 300 impact damage to enemies upon entering and exiting the rift. Lastly, Limbo's Banish can be utilized as an invincibility tool for Limbo's allies to protect them should the situation call for it. But as mentioned earlier, with abilities bypassing the rift, banishing a frame like Mesa can allow Mesa to attack across dimensions, while being completely safe from damage dealt by enemies. This is further incentivized for squad play, because against nullifiers, rifted allies will lose their buffs, but won't be removed from the rift dimension, giving allies a level of protection that not even Limbo himself possesses. The biggest lie creators will tell you about this ability is twofold. The first, it having no place in his kit. Since said creators don't understand the rift, they don't notice the hold cast of Banish opens up other synergies in Limbo's kit, the most important one being the Rift Surge combo, which you will see later. such as with Brozime murdering Limbo's design with Airburst in his 2022 build refresh video by removing Banish for Airburst to bundle enemies in because
Airburst usually not like super notable for a lot of frames, but for Limbo specifically, the notable functionality is that whenever you have your rift open, which is your Cataclysm, you have this bubble. And when enemies are outside the bubble, basically you can't shoot them. And not being able to shoot them is not good. So, if you use Airburst, this will ragdoll enemies and form them into a ball.
when you can simply exit the rift and cast Banish once to get enemies into your rift without all of that setup with Cataclysm, and relying on a constantly shrinking bubble to remain alive when a simple dodge and 25 energy allows you to do the same thing is not very ideal. And this doesn't even include the combos that Limbo has. In addition, you lose the one thing that is most important for Limbo and squad play, the only means of releasing enemies for allies if rifted enemies are left astray. The second lie is the belief that Banish is your quote-unquote free subsume slot on Limbo, when, hopefully, with the mechanics I have shown to you up until now, it is the one ability that you never want to remove when building him. And in reality, it is actually Cataclysm that is your free subsume. How? Why? You'll get to see that later. Limbo, much like other frames, has augments for different abilities in his kit, and Banish is no exception, with Rift Haven. Rift Haven allows Limbo to utilize Banish as a healing tool, where upon banishing an ally, defense or rescue operative, or allied Limbos will heal their HP at a rate of 25% per second, which is affected by power strength. This augment, when combined with Banish, can grant invincibility to allies and provide a means of health tanking against special enemies like Xmas units. However, due to the nature of HP tanking in general, this stops being a viable option after level 500. For this reason, Rift Haven is incredibly niche and is best utilized in cases such as rescue or defense to keep operatives alive via the constant healing and damage immunity. Now, with Limbo's Banish and the credibility of these Limbo guides thrown out the window, Limbo's most iconic and simple ability, Stasis, awaits. Stasis, on the surface, is very mellow in comparison to Banish, Rift Surge, and Cataclysm, and other Warframe abilities as a whole. But it has multiple intricacies that make it paramount in Limbo's kit. Stasis is an ability where upon consuming 50 energy, Limbo presents his right arm forward, where upon doing so, any objects, projectiles, and enemies in the rift will cease movement, only resuming their trajectories when Stasis is casted again before the 15-second duration expires, or letting Stasis end on its own. Now, remember from earlier when I called the Rift a status effect? Well, this is one of the major tells, because no matter how far away an enemy is from Limbo in the Rift, they will become affected by this ability. The reasoning as to why Stasis exists in Limbo's kit is for two major elements that are key to his effectiveness. Crowd control being the first of these. Crowd control has been seen by most as a useless mechanic in Warframe, due to the squishiness of foes, and the game evolving in a direction of going faster and faster to keep collecting loot. But in truth, crowd control in of itself isn't useless. It's what types we are talking about.
Damage potential or special abilities without outright killing them. Things like slows, staggers, stuns, blinds, knockdowns, confusion, disarmament, paralysis effects like sleeping, you probably get the idea. The goal of most CC effects is to create breathing room by limiting what enemies can do, which results in a boost to survivability as well as opening them up to damage.
And this ties directly into the second point of Stasis: survivability. Limbo himself is one of, if not the squishiest frame in the game, only having 370 health and 280 shields, with an armor rating of 105 at max rank, meaning that a simple cough on the steel path would be enough to kill him. Limbo's survivability in and out of the rift is intrinsically linked to his crowd control capabilities. Now this can be seen both as a blessing and a curse, because as mentioned before, Limbo can displace himself across realities, but needs to pull enemies across planes to attack them, which is why Stasis is placed in his kit, to stop enemies from counteracting Limbo in his home, the Rift. There are some major exceptions to Stasis in terms of what can or cannot be halted. For starters, overguarded foes. Overguarded foes can still move while under the effects of Stasis, and can cast abilities if they are an Eximus unit, with said foes only freezing if the overguard is removed via damaging it. This aspect of Limbo and Overguard is by far the biggest misconception when it comes to his effectiveness and survivability, because of the overlooked fact that, well, all Eximus units' projectiles get frozen upon firing, making the issue null and void because Limbo can still get into his rift, making Limbo's crowd control one of the few in the game that technically affects Eximus units by stopping roughly 90% of their attacks from reaching Limbo. But there is a catch to this. You see, Limbo's Stasis has a projectile cap of 300, and what this means is for Overguard units, and especially other units that don't get affected by Stasis as normal, if they hit a projectile cap of 300, the ability will end prematurely, allowing all projectiles that were previously frozen in the rift to continue firing again. However, due to how fast Limbo Stasis can be casted, it isn't as big of an issue so long as you mod him properly. And combine this with abilities going to the rift, allies can easily dispatch said units with little repercussions, leaving only Eximus abilities as the problem for Limbo to counteract. And since most of these abilities have windups, shooting down the Overguard can stop these attacks outright in the rift, while under the Stasis effect. However, melee Eximus units can still be a threat, since melee attacks cannot be halted by Stasis. Eximus units in general are a joke to Limbo, for you can easily place said enemies in the rift at a distance, so long as the user keeps their distance from the unit and jumps over said attacks, or, dare I say, learns what the WASD keys are and moves. Eximus abilities become a little issue in combat scenarios. Another Stasis immune enemy, so to speak, are any boss type enemies that can be put in the rift. The most common of these being the Acolytes, that will attempt to hunt you down on the steel path. Now despite them being bosses, they simply behave like overguarded units, only this time they have overguard all the time. To top it all off, there is one more enemy, or faction rather, that has unique behaviors with Stasis: the sentience of the Tau system. A few years back, Digital Extremes pushed an update to Limbo's kit that made it so sentients were able to adapt to Limbo's Stasis and unfreeze themselves, a panic move in retaliation to the buggy mess that was Scarlet Spear ground operations. In short, sentient enemies under Stasis will be able to unfreeze themselves after a short duration. However, recasting Stasis resets the Stasis effect, with each subsequent cast being shorter and shorter. But seeing as the sentient forces consist mostly of melee units, it means that you don't really need Stasis against them anyway. So, I think I've kept you in Stasis for a little bit too long. So let's move on to Limbo's most underutilized and underexplained ability in his kit, and by far his most important: Rift Surge. Rift Surge is Limbo's third ability, and is by far his most misinterpreted. In fact, one could go as far to say it is the most misunderstood ability in all of Warframe. Limbo, upon casting Rift Surge, will consume 50 energy, and grasp his top hat, dealing a swirling motion with it before placing it back on his head. Any rifted enemies in a 25-meter radius of him will be given a swirling aura of energy, matching the energy colors given to Limbo. Targets killed while Rift Surge is active on them will cause the surge to bounce to another enemy nearby, this bounce range being 25 meters. However, the victim of this bounce is entirely random. Now, this doesn't sound so special at first glance, making the ability seem worthless to the user unless they are utilizing the Augment Mod Rift Torrent. That is, until one investigates the following line. Surged enemies that leave the rift perform a radial banish. And remember what was said earlier about means of leaving the rift dimension? Upon casting Banish on a surged target, or holding the Banish button, the target will be ejected from the rift, and the 5-meter radial banish is performed, dragging nearby enemies, including certain bosses like the Acolytes, into the rift dimension. Upon successfully dragging the enemies into the rift, Rift Surge can be casted once again, allowing the ability to be utilized as a means of holding current targets and gathering new ones into his purgatory. The only way to remove surged enemies is to allow the surge's subsequent banish to expire. Hold casting Banish again after the surge gets triggered, or if a nullifier bubble interacts with the surge target, pulling in new enemies except for the nullifier in the process. This radial banish is unique, however, for its base duration is 18 seconds, in comparison the normal banish is 25, and the Rift Surge aura will last for 25 seconds before disappearing from the affected targets completely. This is how Rift Surge actually works. It is the ability that completes Limbo, and is the ability that allows Limbo to function against any foe he may find in the Origin system. And it is this functionality that nearly every single content creator in Warframe does not mention.
Which is that he has the same problem Banshee does, which is that he is not allowed to function in content. The clunkiest, most horrifically shitty thing to be doing that is slow and not effective and doesn't work on all the enemies, and it is a colossal problem because the solution to that is to simply make Limbo not work on anything relevant.
Enemies. Cool. Just freezes stuff. Awesome. Rift Surge. This pretty much surges nearby rift-bound enemies with Rift Surge. It pretty much just does some AoE banish and damage. Cool. Awesome, right? Banish and damage, right? Well, no damage, just banish. Banish, banish, banish. Which is kind of pseudo damage. So
May it be out of inexperience, lack of research, or conveying the information needed in properly explaining Limbo to said audience. Although this is likely a mix of all three. Since this information is easily found on the wiki under the Rift Surge segment, and found in what I consider the first Limbible, Triburos' ancient but amazing guide on Limbo from 2017, where he very clearly demonstrated the mechanic to his audience.
Small with a banish. He then enters the rift himself and casts Rift Surge. At this point, Limbo has a few seconds to do whatever he wants before the banish of his victims wears off. Let's say he kills a few of his banished targets, but not all of them. Once banish wears off, the rest of your victims will have their surges trigger, which will knock them down and send them right back into the rift, resetting their banish duration. The easiest way to see Rift Surge is as a banish trap. Basically, it's an alternate way of sending enemies into the rift plane.
And this was repeated years later with Nova Umbral's own video about Limbo, of which both of these videos amassed hundreds of thousands of views, solidifying this knowledge within Warframe's history for everyone to see. And due to the nature of Warframe tilesets being enclosed, having a range of 130% is enough to keep this banish-rebanish loop going for long periods of time. It is this particular mechanic that allows Limbo to perform well in Corpus missions. The reason why is that he doesn't need to worry about nullifiers closing his Cataclysm and shutting down his act, as most people will lead you to believe, since he can utilize this banish-rebanish loop to complete his objectives without worrying about the nullifiers halting his performance. And upon merging this mechanic with his augment mod Rift Torrent, Limbo converts from a crowd control god into a harbinger of death. Rift Surge is the second augment for Limbo, and its mechanical functionality seems simple on the surface. For every enemy that has a Rift Surge aura on them, Limbo gains 30% damage per enemy affected, which does scale with power strength. Now this 30% damage is what we call a base damage bonus, which is something that big creators higher up in the community do acknowledge.
This damage increase is not its own multiplier. This is the same damage slot as Serration,
But what people get wrong about it is how to mod your weapons to take advantage of it. Since it is a base damage bonus, it will function on your weapon the same way mods like Serration and Hornet Strike apply, boosting all of your damage before critical hits. Status procs or other vulnerabilities are taken into account, meaning that Rift Torrent shines on two types of weapons: high crit chance and crit damage weapons that will cause the torrent damage to be amplified based on said modifiers. The ALAC is a prime example of this with a 21% crit chance and a 2.3x crit multiplier, where without Rift Torrent the damage is insignificant, but with Rift Torrent the damage gets amplified considerably. Whereas in a status heavy weapon like the Phantasma, where it only has 11% crit chance and 1.9x multiplier, it performs decently, but not very comparable to what the ALAC is capable of putting out. If one wanted to build the ALAC fully around this mechanic of Rift Torrent, there are a multitude of things to consider. The first being critical damage multipliers. Mods like Hammershot and Vital Sense are most desirable for this because they give critical damage bonuses that will amplify the crit multiplier, and since the ALAC will crit very consistently, it means that we are getting this damage bonus pretty much all the time. The second is arcanes like Primary Deadhead. Now yes, this arcane does give additive damage like Merciless, as I scolded Brozyme before in his build, but we want this arcane for the plus 30% headshot multiplier, because this applies after the torrent and critical damage buffs. Then, we want to use some cold damage here to amplify the critical damage further, because cold procs now amplify critical damage multipliers. And with the Cyclone that I'm using to apply Viral, it allows Limbo to get an extra damage modifier in the form of the Viral damage proc, which will amplify the total damage by 325% at 10 stacks. This by itself is solid, and more than viable for Limbo to use, but it's the second type of weapons that are most interesting. The second type of weapons, any that gain multiplicative gun CO with the galvanized status mods. In Warframe, Gun CO, or Condition Overload for short, is a mechanic where based on how many status effects you have on an enemy, the attacks of your weapon will gain a direct damage bonus. And traditionally, these are what we call additive bonuses, meaning that they function like a Serration mod, boosting damage before other bonuses like crits, viral procs, etc. However, some weapons, mainly projectile-based weapons, gain what we call multiplicative gun CO. Multiplicative being a bonus applied after other modifiers, like crits are taken into account. The previous example being Primary Deadhead's headshot multiplier. In testing the ALAC once again with the gun CO taken into account, the damage skyrockets due to these mechanics interacting with each other. Stack this with any multi-shot modifiers as well, and you also get more damage because you're getting more shots out of your weapon at a single time. This can be taken even further with other multiplicative bonuses. In this case, multiplicative bonuses such as Warframe abilities, most notably Roar. Since Roar also applies after all other modifiers, it too can stack with Rift Torrent, causing the damage to reach astronomical levels of damage due to the simple craft of stacking these mechanics on top of each other one after the other in layers. But that isn't the end of it. Limbo's Rift is a mechanic that Limbos in the same squad all share. This includes all rifted enemies that they drag into the rift with them, meaning that if every Limbo has the augment equipped, they all share the Rift Torrent bonus with each other. And, most importantly, the Limbos that have not surged the enemies keep the bonus until they exit the rift again. Rift Torrent is a wild augment that is quite useful to Limbo. However, there are reasons to not utilize it. Said reasons I will bring up in a later segment, for the time is not right just yet. We must move on to Limbo's grand finale. Limbo's visually striking, but mechanically off-putting ability, Cataclysm.
I'm in, Tenno. This
Cataclysm is Limbo's crowning achievement, and it is the ability that Limbo is most infamous for. Limbo consumes 100 energy and gracefully levitates himself and his top hat above the ground, his arms outstretched. In doing so, he crosses his arms together in the final moments. The fabric of reality is distorted, and in its place lies a 16-meter wide sphere of void energy. Within it, a fragment of the Rift Dimension made visible to Limbo and allies, but will slowly shrink over the course of 30 seconds, and at 5 meters will disappear in a void explosion. Any allies that enter the sphere will be considered part of the Rift Dimension until they exit through the void membrane, or allow the Cataclysm to collapse in on itself once more. Enemies that enter and exit the Cataclysm will take 300 impact damage as part of a transitional damage system. In addition, the Cataclysm's explosion damage scales with the max health of enemies, as well as their max shields, as well as the range of the Cataclysm before it is collapsed. 10% of the average health and shields of all the enemies inside, to be precise. However, since said damage takes into account enemy armor and enemy resistances, it does not make it ideal to try using. Cataclysm is aimable before casting and be aimed up to any object at an infinite range away. Cataclysm is the one ability in Limbo's kit that players and creators utilize incorrectly more than any other in the game. It puts said players and creators into a trap, thinking that the Rift portal is the Rift in its entirety.
Space, and he's unique. That's all I have to say. He's quite unique. He's not a bad Warframe. He just takes a 5-head player for you to play.
The notable functionality is that whenever you have your rift open, which is your Cataclysm, you have this bubble. And when enemies are outside the bubble, basically you can't shoot them. And not being able to...
This isn't entirely the user's fault, because the visual design and description of Cataclysm is very misleading. The average players of Warframe and big creators see Cataclysm as a frost bubble, being a solid object that allies and enemies cannot shoot into or through.
I like to call him the interdimensional frost, okay? Because he's pretty much interdimensional frost.
To understand why this is the case, one must look to the description. A violent blast of void energy tears open a pocket of the rift plane, which can sustain itself for a short period before collapsing in another lethal blast. The text implies that what you're seeing is a pocket of the Rift Dimension manifested in physical form, which the Limbo and allies can access by physically walking into it. A portal between worlds. However, the way it's coded to function is nothing of the sort. Cataclysm is said to be a portal, but in reality is a rift field, so to speak. Because if it were an actual portal, bullets should be able to travel inside and outside of the rift, but instead bullets will pass through as if the Cataclysm isn't even there, and hit anything that is either outside the Cataclysm or enemies that cannot be in the rift, like the Void Rigs. Which, on a side note, DE, please fix this, it's really stupid. Bullets seem to be coded to only interact with enemies if the ally or enemy firing it is on the same plane first. This is incredibly frustrating because the text itself implies said possibility to the user, yet it functions as an aura, not a portal. And it's this aura that creates extremely unique combos for Limbo to use with Cataclysm. Since it is a rift field, Limbo can use Cataclysm as a rift primer, so to speak, casting Cataclysm, then casting Rift Surge. So upon closing Cataclysm, you now have a group of enemies primed for the Banish Surge combo shown previously. Another more out there function is to use the Cataclysm as a massive riot shield, standing at a distance away in the rift and spawning the Cataclysm aura at a distance, allowing Limbo to dispatch enemies safely without worrying about the Cataclysm closing and making him vulnerable. And since the Cataclysm is a giant rift aura, so to speak, it means that you can use the Cataclysm as your main means of getting defensive targets into the rift, placing them on different sections of the map or around said objects to protect them. This can also be used to grant allies access to the Rift Dimension without having to use Banish on them, spawning the Cataclysm field on a certain section of the map, and as enemies get close, Limbo can go around banishing them and putting them into the Rift Dimension, and since the allies will be in the Rift Dimension as well, they can attack through the bubble from the inside out. And this gets more complicated when we throw in the Augment Cataclysmic Continuum. Cataclysmic Continuum is the augment for Cataclysm, where enemies killed in Cataclysm increases its duration by 1 second. This does not stop the shrinking though, and is not affected by any stats on Limbo. This looks to be a terrible augment, and initially I was in said camp. However, after experimentation, this augment has niche utility, with base range riot bubble setups with high duration. Creates a high duration cap, causing the shrink rate of Cataclysm to be reduced further and further, where the shrink rate becomes unnoticeable, making it harder for enemies to be ejected for Limbo and allies if you're doing a camping bubble build, so to speak. With that, Limbo's kit is complete. Banish, Stasis, Rift Surge, Cataclysm, all presented in their void-blessed glory. And now we can move on to the real stuff. How do you play Limbo? Limbo's playstyle is difficult to describe in one sentence or a singular phrase, for its design and mechanics conflict with each other. Making enemies invincible to defend yourself, use enemies to enhance your damage, displace enemies and/or objectives across realities, all a series of opposites in the modern-day sandbox as Warframe. For all Warframes and their designs today are built more so around just running and gunning over careful consideration and planning. Limbo's abilities are all built around accessing and controlling the Rift Dimension, so he can achieve objectives in peace. Limbo is, at its core, a portal master, and Limbo's kit is crafted for one singular purpose: absolute control. Manipulating his and the enemy positioning to command the flow of the battlefield, with the Rift Dimension at its center. This mechanic of the Rift sets Limbo miles away from other frames, because its effectiveness is tied entirely to how you apply the Rift in combat scenarios. In fact, Limbo's kit synergizes so well together that if one wished, they can play him completely modless, for Limbo's kit is dictated by the Rift mechanic and the weapons you use with him, with mods simply enhancing aspects of these abilities, unlike the majority of frames where mods directly boost and determine the frame's effectiveness. Unfortunately, these aspects are difficult to pick up on, because of how his kit visibly looks to the audience. His Banish is a cone that puts enemies in the Rift, but can double as a front-facing defensive tool when combined with Stasis, putting certain targets like Eximus into the Rift without having to worry about them attacking you. Stasis being his sole means of CC, and his primary form of survivability. His Rift Surge is a sort of anchor for enemies in his dimension, re-banishing them when their banish timers run out, but is his main means of catching new enemies across dimensions. And Cataclysm is visibly a defensive dome, but is also an easy means of gathering enemies in the Rift from across realities, creating a fully synergized kit that, when applied intelligently, can get the user through any mission type, with your modding setups influencing the effectiveness of Limbo's portals, so to speak. However, it should be important to note that yes, one can mod however he or she chooses. There are universal constants between builds that need to be addressed. Casting speed. In the discussion of Limbo's abilities, I omitted his casting speed for this reason. His abilities at base casting speed are extremely clunky and require at minimum natural talent to make them most effective, for Limbo's CC capabilities and survivability are tied to how quickly he can activate his powers on the field, with 2 Tau yellow shards for casting speed to be most preferred once you reach the Archon hunts. Next to casting speed, Limbo's top priority is boosting duration, for his entire kit revolves around manipulating enemies for as long as possible, making duration effectively Limbo's lifeline. with his true dump stat being strength unless utilizing the augment mods Rift Haven and Rift Torrent, for his primary form of damage does not come from his powers, but the weapons utilized in combat. And to conclude, Limbo's builds drastically change between solo and squad play, because Limbo's Rift, in the right hands, can be a squad's greatest ally, but only when the Rift is applied in a limited fashion, such as the Banish tech to protect DPS caster frames, or staying at base or negative range, meaning that your Rift only affects certain sections of the map, but not the entire area. For example, a high-range build is not ideal due to allies not having Rift access of their own, and can destroy squad synergies with certain frames, like Harrow, since he has no DPS focus abilities of his own, leading him to rely entirely on the goodwill of the Limbo player puppeting him. Thus, the first playstyle we must discuss is those revolving around the Riot Bubble. The Riot Bubble setups, negative and base range, are a playstyle that creators big and small traditionally do not recommend or even consider, maybe with the typical removal of Banish for a subzoom and relying entirely on a shrinking portal to CC the enemies in place, with you being vulnerable if the portal closes in on itself, giving enemies the opportunity to hit you, since your main form of survivability is now gone. The Riot Bubble solves this by having a low rift coverage, with the base range of 16 meters being more than enough coverage for you to stand on the exterior of the portal, firing into it to damage enemies, and if the portal collapses, it doesn't create a vulnerability state for Limbo. Imagine the playstyle of this build akin to fishing, using the Cataclysm as a massive net to drag enemies into your dimension. And if you stay close enough to the Cataclysm, but not within it, the targets become surgible, so that when the Cataclysm pops or closes on certain mission types, the enemies will remain trapped in the Rift dimension. However, by leaving the Cataclysm on the map, Limbo creates a choke point for enemies to wander into, being perpetually stuck to the bubble, this being most prevalent with melee enemies, trivializing some factions like the Infested entirely. And by doing so, still employ the Rift Surge Banish combo. It won't be as effective due to the 5 meter range, but with other tools such as grouping abilities, it can be manageable. This playstyle becomes a bit more straightforward with negative range, 49% range to be precise, using a Cataclysm bubble as your sole means of catching enemies in the Rift and defending targets from damage. But there is a catch. The Banish Rift Surge combo becomes far less prevalent, meaning if one wishes, they may subsume Banish or Rift Surge in this state. However, one does lose the utilities of keeping enemies in the Rift via this kind of setup, and the ability to quickly banish targets should the need arise outside of the Rift. Again, this setup would best be used with high duration, but the rapid placement and destabilization of Cataclysm means one would want to have some efficiency or energy regeneration, like Energy Nexus. And with this high duration and light rift coverage taken into account, it becomes the best build to utilize in defense, mobile defense, in any mission where the priority is to protect a target for long periods of time, for the target is safe in another dimension, where the enemies are unable to interact with it. What you do not do is what is shown here.
Yes, League of Legends. You want to talk about League of Legends?
I'm not talking about defeating anybody.
This is It's over! Dude! It's so over!
I had silence on. I had stasis.
Oh my
I had both abilities on.
God, you fucking suck!
Nova Umbral has a Cataclysm everywhere, and because of that, the objective and the enemies are on the same plane, meaning that the target was destined to die if Stasis were to go down. A method of preventing this would be to surge and close Cataclysm, creating the reverse, displacing enemies and returning the target home before Stasis were to expire. This functionality can be seen once again with the Index. Utilizing Cataclysm with energy regeneration efficiency can protect the goal, stopping the rival team from scoring points and progressing the mission. On a side note, Limbo has a unique interaction with the Mimic in this mission, where they can mimic Limbo and his dodge, and if Stasis is active, they too become frozen, because the dodge generates a portal and an entrance into the rift. Then we come to the opposite end of the spectrum, the high-range Banish Surge builds. Banish Surge builds are the most common Limbo setups one will find on the internet, prioritizing high-range values of 190% or higher to allow the Banish Surge combo to spread from enemy to enemy, utilizing Cataclysm as a Banish Surge primer to get said combos started, and trapping enemies in Limbo's Rift indefinitely, controlling the map through the combo system, akin to Saren Ender's Spores, only with Limbo, it's crowd control and weapon buffing in the form of his Augment Rift Torrent, while Saren deals direct damage outright with his Spores and damage ramp-up mechanic. Due to the nature of this playstyle, one may remove Cataclysm entirely and rely on the Banish Surge combo if said user can micromanage their enemy density, with one of the best subsume options being Silence, for it can nullify Eximus abilities and other special attacks while providing a stun. However, there are 3 major issues with this kind of playstyle, the first being in regards to Silence itself. Silence will not nullify abilities already active on the field, and enemies leaving the radius will regain abilities if one is not careful. These next 2 are in regards to any high-range setups one may choose. Cataclysm has rift properties that are different from Banish and Surge. Banish and Surge are abilities that obey line of sight while Cataclysm does not. This sounds amazing, for one can banish enemies across entire tile sets very easily, but it can quickly lead to what I have coined the Surge Block. Surge blocks are an inevitability on any high-range setup, where surged enemies build up on the opposite ends of the battlefield, or many tile sets away from the combat scenarios. Enemies enter the rift and become surged, but due to the base application range of surge being 25 meters, and being amplified by mods, enemies ejected from the rift far away will have their surges reapplied, and since enemies spawn in rooms away from the user, it leads to enemies being locked in a choke point that the Limbo does not realize is being created until it is too late. This problem still persists even without Cataclysm, but doesn't occur as quickly, for it takes longer for the Banish Surge loop to spread. It's for this reason that finding the lowest range possible to make the setup perform without the fear of surge blocks is a necessity, with the lowest range possible being 130%, creating a Goldilocks zone of Riot Bubble and Banish Surge optimization, a perfect balance between playstyles. Then there's the final problem, Cataclysm's utility. Cataclysm holds together Limbo's kit so well that although not its center point, it can play a huge role in how he is used, with some elements making it mandatory to keep, such as bosses. Bosses like the Acolytes get reduced rift duration, causing them to get ejected faster from the rift the more times you banish/surge them. With Cataclysm, the duration becomes infinite, where they will not be able to leave unless a Cataclysm implodes or if they leave the void membrane. This in turn also allows the Limbo to utilize the Rift Torrent bonus against bosses, because the boss can now be kept in the Rift thanks to Cataclysm. And this also becomes one of the few ways to fight against enemies like the Nullifiers, by using the Banish Surge combo to kill enemies with Surge active, letting the Surge hop to another enemy on death and casting Cataclysm to immediately pull said units into the Rift, with Nullifiers auto-closing the Cataclysm for the user. And when combined with 5 Tau Shards and Natural Talent, you can get something like this. Special thanks to my co-host Dark from Top Hat Culture for showing me this tech. Cataclysm closes after a few seconds from interacting with any nullifiers on the field, but due to the speed of which I can apply Surge thanks to the 5 Tower Shards, I can activate Surge before Cataclysm collapses, pulling the enemies in once again, allowing Limbo to play around nullifiers if the user decides to. One may be looking at this information and asking, how is this a bad thing? Well, it creates a situation where Limbo realistically cannot function without all of its powers. Now yes, there are some amazing subsumables other than Silence. My personal favorite, Vile Rush, allowing for mobility, cold procs, and slow all in a single power for free, especially in disruption missions where the pools of ice can be used to slow down the Demolists, because the cold pools spawned by Vile Rush cannot be nullified, or Ophanim Eyes, granting directional slow and armor strip, all of these working cross-rift, but it requires the removal of the easiest method of interacting across dimensions when the need arises, Cataclysm, forcing the player to choose what utilities to sacrifice. For if Banish is removed, the 1-3 becomes uncontrollable. Stasis leads to Limbo being nigh unusable. Surge, especially at max rank, is key to keeping enemies in his dimension, and leaving Cataclysm as the slot. And even Cataclysm has a place in his kit at high range, especially against Corpus units. Limbo is king of interception specifically because he is able to place Cataclysm on different parts of the map, specifically the nodes, to keep enemies from interacting with the interception consoles. Now, the enemy can be put into the rift and not interact with the console at all because it always remains on the material plane, or vice versa. The console can be put into the rift via Cataclysm, and enemies cannot interact with the console through the rift, creating a situation where Cataclysm is borderline mandatory. Now, of course, the Banish Surge combo exists, but if one wants to get it done with the least amount of friction, they need Cataclysm to get it done efficiently. However, it should be said that the way someone may approach Limbo's kit is ultimately up to them to decide, with these simply being the most common methods of utilizing Limbo's kit. But there are a few other mechanics one must consider, survivability being one of these. Limbo's Rift is his primary form of damage reduction, allowing Limbo to enter a transparent state that stops melee attacks and projectiles, but Eximus abilities still remain a problem, despite how easy most of them are to avoid. To combat these abilities, there exists many tools that can be applied to Limbo, each with different levels of effectiveness and use cases in the game. The first of these being, well, health tanking, but not in the traditional sense. Again, massive thanks to Dark for showing me this tech. Limbo's HP pool is very minuscule in comparison to other frames in the game, and his low armor doesn't help either. But there is a way to make it larger without literally giving him health mods, and it involves these 5 materials: Adaptation, Arcane Guardian, Molt Reconstruct, Quick Thinking, and a single Tau Blue Shard. Now, this is a lot of materials just to make Limbo survive, but regardless, let's see how this works. Arcane Guardian functions where when Limbo gets damaged, he has a chance of gaining 900 armor. During this time, Adaptation will trigger, giving up to 90% damage reduction to the primary damage type in a single attack. Once the attack chews through the shields, Limbo's DR with just the Fortifier Arcane will be 77% when the 900 armor is combined with his base armor value. And with Limbo's HP pool being 370, it means that Limbo technically, with the DR taken into account, has an effective hit point value of 1608.69. Nice. 1609 to round up. This doesn't include the DR from Adaptation yet, which applies after armor reduction is taken into account. Meaning that in a hypothetical example, Limbo were to take primarily slash damage and only slash damage, Limbo would have an effective hit point value of 16,090. That isn't the highest HP in the world, but for general content, it's pretty considerable, especially for a frame as fragile as Limbo. Now, let us remove the adaptation and focus just on the 1609 effective hit points. In order for Limbo to die, Quick Thinking would consume Limbo's energy in place of the damage taken at 240% effectiveness, or 2.4x, meaning for Limbo to technically die and remain dead, he would have to take an attack that, when converted, would be higher than 670 energy on average in his reserves. Something one is able to easily alleviate with Archon or Prime the Flow, which boosts Limbo's energy reserves. This not including the damage reduction of adaptation in these calculations. And since most of the time one dies to Eximus units, and enemies in general, is the status effects inflicted by the abilities or attacks, it provides a method of energy tanking that allows for Limbo to take on most missions very easily, with the Blue Shard and Molt Reconstruct providing methods of healing Limbo after taking damage from said units, with Limbo's passive providing the energy regeneration necessary to keep the loop going. This method of survivability works best on lower Steel Path missions, where proc damage isn't enough to instantaneously down yourself, or missions like Archon Hunts or Deep Archimedia, where no revives can occur and external modifiers like health leeching exist. This can be a little excessive, just to make Limbo work in all forms of content without issue. But there is another more common method that you likely already know: shield gating. Shield gating is a method that is excessively used among Warframe's player base, and Limbo, unsurprisingly, is very good at applying it. Shield gating is a simple mechanic involving the Augur mods. These mods, including Brief Respite, simply take the energy consumed by ability casts and convert them into shields, with your efficiency stat and the number of Augur mods equipped affecting this conversion rate, granting Limbo near immunity outside of toxin damage, which bypasses shields. But there are optional tools to enhance this tech further, Arcane Aegis being the first of these. Arcane Aegis grants a 3% chance on shield damage to regenerate shields at a rate of 30% per second at max rank. When used alongside shield gating tactics, Limbo can be granted a 12-second period of shield regeneration that cannot be interrupted by anything, giving Limbo some time to operate outside of the rift, may it be for recovery purposes or for combating unriftable foes, which can be pushed even further with Rapid Resilience. Rapid Resilience is, by far, one of the most underrated and underutilized survivability mods in the game, reducing SAS effects on yourself by 75% at max rank. This includes everything from damage over time effects like Slash to slow effects like Cold. But for shield gating purposes, it is paramount. For damage over time effects get reduced duration when the mod is active. So if your gate lasts longer than the damage over time effects that are inflicted onto you, they will expire before your shield gate ends if the shields break, reducing the necessary gate casts in order to survive considerably. Applying this retroactively to the energy tank build shown earlier can make it harder for the quick thinking tech to trigger, and reducing the likelihood of death via repeated DOT damage. To top it all off, there's one method that is most potent above all others: Secondary Fortifier. Secondary Fortifier is an arcane introduced in the Jade Shadows update that, when combined with Limbo, provides the best protection possible against Eximus units, and all threats when outside of the Rift. This is done in two distinct ways. The first is providing an 8x multiplier against Eximus at max rank, making it perfect for clearing out Eximus units quickly, with its secondary effect being the most important function for Limbo. For every 100 damage to Overguard, give 1 Overguard to the user, granting Limbo an extra health gate, but most importantly, status immunity. So long as Limbo has Overguard, he will never die at any point. And since he remains in the Rift for extended periods of time, the likelihood of losing this Overguard is very minimal. Secondary Fortifier is best used with the previous methods, until one can reach the skill requirements to use just Fortifier in its entirety. For with a good enough knowledge of the Rift, survivability mods become pointless to invest into on Limbo. With the following methods made clear, more niche mechanics and setups can be experimented with Limbo having a particularly odd synergy with Stealth. Stealth mechanics grant Limbo an array of advantages in and out of combat. For non-combat scenarios, like spy missions, Limbo can use mods like Untraceable on the terminals just outside of the vaults, and combine with Limbo and Rifted allies not triggering the lasers or traps because they can only be triggered on the physical plane. It can allow easy passage into said vaults because the traps will not be triggered and the cameras cannot see allies if they're using invisibility methods. Or through companions like the Shade. Shade having the ability known as Ghost, where whenever Limbo or Shade are within 24 meters of an enemy, Shade will blanket Limbo and himself in an invisibility aura, only breaking when Limbo attacks enemies with his weapons, or enemies leave the 24-meter radius. And since most vaults are patrolled by Limbo's foes, it makes this tech ideal for utility-focused missions. But Shade still retains a place in combat-focused scenarios, allowing Limbo to simply stop attacking, and so long as the invisible 8-second cooldown of Ghost is over, regain invisibility and allows Limbo to reposition himself on the battlefield, may it be on a vantage point like a ledge, or around Eximus units not yet rifted, giving an easy means of dragging enemy units into the rift because abilities do not break this invisibility. On the topic of invisibility, there is another niche application of stealth Limbo can exploit. However, I am very inexperienced with the mechanics in question, for they involve melee stealth multipliers. For that reason, I would like to employ and give special thanks to a close friend of mine, Jim the Fuzz, who is going to explain this application to you all.
Thank you, Sci-Fi. And greetings, everyone. I'm James the Fuzz, friend of Sci-Fi and a Limbo main with a frankly concerning amount of hours on Frame. I'm indeed here to show you the specifics of Limbo's interactions with stealth multipliers. And I promise you, this is a fun one. So let's get into it. Okay, first we're gonna have to define exactly what a stealth multiplier is. And for that, we got this little setup here. Basically, the way that the stealth multiplier system works is that while you're invisible, enemies will enter a state of unawareness. While in this state of unawareness, as you can see, they'll wander about, and if you hit them with a melee weapon, any melee hit will be a critical hit, and on top of that, the critical damage will gain a additive 7 times multiplier on top of all of your other critical mods. Now, there's a couple of downsides to this. First and foremost, you cannot keep getting this bonus, because if you spam your melee attack, as you can see, you only get a crit for the first hit, and from there, it is all normal damage. This is basically because the enemy becomes aware for approximately 3 seconds after the last instance of damage taken. Now, what this basically means is that if I hit the enemy, and then wait about 3 seconds, and then hit him again, you'll basically keep getting the multiplier. What exactly does that have to do with Limbo, you may ask? Well, I'm glad you asked. Stasis has a rather unique property, in that unlike Frost or Atlas's statues, which just freezes the animations part of the AI, Stasis is capable of outright pausing the whole AI, making it so that no state in the AI can be changed, unless specified otherwise IDE. Limbo, for example, was, back in the day, able to pause status duration with Stasis as it was an AI state. Until, of course, DE nerfed it. Now, consider the following. Awareness is an AI state, which means that if the enemy is unaware of us, as they enter Stasis, we are now able to do stuff like this.
Limbo being able to manipulate stealth multipliers to his own ends is nothing to scoff at. Although not the only one to do this, it feeds into potential synergies between himself and the various melee weapons Warframe has. Another niche application involves Limbo and Warframe damage types, most notably Blast. Limbo's Rift Torrent is an additive bonus, as discussed in the Rift Surge segment, manipulating his weapon damage, including the damage over time effects he selects. Electricity, Toxin, Heat, Imagine It, Limbo amplifies it, with the reworked Blast providing the most intriguing boost. Blast mechanically functions, where on Blast status effect, Blast will linger on the target before decaying, producing a radial explosion dealing 30% of the weapon's base damage, with 10 stacks increasing the explosion radius and dealing 300% of the weapon's base damage, imparting the same effect if the enemy expires with a stack already applied to them. With Rift Torrent, Limbo is able to increase blast damage unlike any other frame, with most Rift Torrent modifiers easily reaching thousands in the majority of sessions, yielding Limbo absurd damage values and room clearing potential with the right weapons, mainly high fire rate weapons to repeatedly apply the stacks. The many shenanigans of Rift Torrent extends to helmet abilities, though scaling with weapon damage to be exact, the most common of these being Breach Surge. Breach Surge is Wisp's subzoom and has been repeatedly abused by the player base for its ease of use and high damage potential. On cast, Wisp or the frame equipped with the ability consumes 75 energy and ignites a spark of energy in clasped hands, unleashing the spark and blinding enemies within 18 meters of the user. The blinded enemies will unleash smaller sparks, till the 16-second duration is over, said sparks having 20% radiation status chance. If a blinded target is killed, it will unleash the spark and travel to another enemy within 10 meters of death. The damage amplified by 2 times the damage of the kill shot. Limbo's Rift Torrent will simply amplify the spark damage indirectly by boosting the damage of the weapon employed to carry out the slaughter. The sparks in question are rift piercing, which will increase Limbo's DPS significantly in the right scenarios. From what I have tested, Breach Surge is the only ability that behaves this way, but if there are any others, let me know in the comments down below. Evidently, we have one more mechanic that is not experimented with often, especially with the Rift Walker. Parkour velocity is an element of Warframe's mobility that affects a Warframe's movement, such as dodges, slides, and bullet jumps, amplifying one's velocity, boosting these elements, making a frame faster in this regard. Limbo's dodge being what matters in these circumstances, for Limbo's dodge turns from being an entrance point into a mobility and survivability tool. With just 5 Tau shards, Limbo can dodge around his enemies so quickly that he can get behind and banish them before the enemy unit has time to turn around, creating a window of opportunity for Limbo in single target scenarios, with multi-targets being rather unruly to rely on this movement to stay immune to damage. However, it does get one across tile sets faster as a result, making it easier to survey and control the mission. These niche synergies with the mechanics and abilities further extends to the weapons and weapon types hidden in Warframe's arsenal, with the most iconic of these being the Miter. Found by farming the duo Vor and Krill on Ceres, the Miter has been a staple weapon of Limbo for years, this being spurred by the Miter's augment, Neutralizing Justice, where, when fired, the individual blades of the Miter have a 90% chance to instantly pop nullifier bubbles, and builds up the Justice status effect. The status effect itself isn't important to Limbo, it's the primary effect that takes center stage. The Miter, with the augment, provides a quick and easy means of dealing with nullifiers, disabling any that come into contact with the blades, and with the addition of the Incarnon, the Miter becomes one of the greatest tricks up Limbo's sleeve, with other rifles working adequately with Limbo. But one specific weapon type shines above the rest. Chaining beam weapons. Chain weapons, like the Amperex, synergize brilliantly with Limbo's kit for the sole reason of only chaining the targets on the same plane as himself, meaning ammo, chains, and the user's focus is not wasted on said units, providing an easy means of singling out rifted and non-rifted foes. Combine this with Punch Through to allow the beam on Punch Through hit to gain additional chains, all of which can be applied to secondaries like the Cycron, but unfortunately does not apply to all secondaries, for weapons like the Ocucore are excluded, where the tendrils spawned on kill and sustained by the Augment Sentient Surge cannot gain Punch Through, restricting the damage and targeting to the main beam and the 4 tendrils that can be produced, with these beams latching on to enemies within 40 degrees of the reticle. On the subject of pistols, another case can be found in the Zymos. The Zymos is an infested pistol purchased from the father on Deimos and holds 2 confusing properties, the first being its headshot mechanic. On headshot, the victim's head explodes, releasing a swarm of infested bees that seek out the nearest foe. On contact with the enemy's head, the bees explode, force proccing impact status, with its crit chance and crit damage multipliers being applied as a square, instead of the traditional additive bonus most weapons gain. This is already a solid secondary for its AoE damage potential. Yet, this isn't what makes the Zymos so formidable. It's the bees themselves. The bees seem to spawn as a separate instance of damage akin to Warframe abilities, meaning they bypass the Rift barrier, granting Limbo a cross-rift damaging tool. And so long as Limbo has an enemy that he can torture, Limbo can nuke cross-rift while being completely immune to damage. However, if you do not own the Zymos, there is an alternative that is much easier to utilize, that being the Pack Seeker arcane from Fortuna. Pack Seeker is pretty simple. On headshot kill with any kit gun weapon, it will create these sparks that will travel to enemies nearby. These sparks seem to use the same code that the Zymos does, allowing for significantly higher cross-rift damage than the Zymos, but it is a bit less consistent, since these sparks have physical interactions with the world around them, meaning that if they hit something like a roof or a wall, they will disappear. So long as you use this weapon in very open tile sets, the Pack Seeker will be able to do its job quite effectively. Yet, the Zymos and Pack Seeker arcanes are not the only tools capable of this kind of carnage. The dual I-Core Incarnon has a unique mechanic, where when an enemy is killed, while the Incarnon mode is active, enemies leave behind a toxin pool, dealing pure toxin damage and proccing any elemental stats effects on the I-Core. These clouds also spawn as a separate instance, ignoring an enemy's state and attacking them directly. Melees in general have the most awkward interactions with the Rift Dimension, with the Blade and Whips following this, allowing their heavy attacks to grab enemies across planes, moving them into new positions for Limbo to exploit. Due to this interaction, a member of my server, Cephalon, inadvertently discovered that melee arcanes like Afflictions can be triggered cross-rift, and when combined with companion abilities like Arc Coil from Doriga, it allows for a method of cross-rift priming. But there is one melee weapon class in particular that synergizes best with Limbo, and said class is the Glaives. Glaives, like the Serrata and Falcor, are disc weapons that can be thrown at enemies and can also trigger AoE explosions to deal damage in larger radiuses. On the surface, these weapons are not very interesting and don't hold much value to Limbo. What makes them so potent, however, is when they apply Rift Torrent. DE Spaghetti Code has caused the Glaives to apply the Rift Torrent bonus twice, meaning that Glaives deal significantly more damage than they should be. And when this damage is united with the arcane melee influence, it allows for Glaives, or rather any melee weapon, to damage cross-rift. For the melee influence is simply spreading electricity damage as well as any other status effects on the weapon to enemies nearby, regardless of what plane they exist on. There is another version of this in the Za arcane, Exodia Contagion. Exodia Contagion makes it so that while aim gliding with your melee, you can swing it to release a spore. This spore, when hitting a surface, will explode, dealing impact and viral damage, and other status effects on the weapon. But the chances are very minor, so for that reason, it is mostly used for the double dipping damage, and since it has a large enough AoE, it doesn't really matter if influence procs or not. But this is all mute, without an ally at your side to fight alongside with. Companions help to fill that void. Companions each have unique synergies with Limbo and his Rift, mainly through the application of bond mods like Duplex Bond, granting more clones to your companions, or Vicious Bond, allowing companions to armor strip for you. Helios and Panzer being the greatest abusers of this mod, for Helios armor strips directly through Deconstructor, while Panzer spreads viral spores, and if used with Vicious Bond, provides two means of damage amplification. But there's two companions in Warframe Sandbox that open up Limbo's kit the most. Hounds being the DPS aspect Limbo struggles with. The Hounds acquired by Slain Sisters of Parvos have access to every bond and robotic exclusive mod, making them capable in performance as Sentinels, with their exclusive Hound mods taking them up a notch. Each of these mods turn a Hound into a damage platform on par with Warframes themselves, but one mod shines above all the others: Synergized Prospectus. Synergized Prospectus sends out a spark that ricochets between 7 enemies, and combined once again with Manifold Bond, turns it into a primer and damage power for the Hounds to exploit. Further empowered by mods like the Mecha Set, as well as Contagion Bond, making Hounds the best asset for the damage lovers out there. Even countering nullifiers for the Prospectus mod spreads electricity status, which deals its damage in an AoE. And with electricity AoE shutting down the bubble as soon as the bubble reactivates, Limbo is made more comfortable in Corpus missions by offloading some responsibilities onto the Hound, with the upcoming companion offering the best utility with the recent Rift changes: Nautilus. Nautilus feels like it was meant to be used with Limbo for its one and only ability, Cordon. Cordon groups up nearby foes for Limbo, reducing the time to kill significantly, with this pull working on stationary targets like Stasis enemies, making it best used with the Riot Bubble builds, pulling enemies from outside Cataclysm in, with Verglass being amazing as a weapon in its own right, with modding for Cold and Shivering Contagion providing light CC and damage buffing for the user. Limbo is the ultimate sandbox in Warframe. crowd control, survivability, damage, all done while having an identity. But nothing is ever perfect. Thus, I must complete this lesson with an equally important aspect of the Riftwalker: his flaws, bugs, nerfs. All done, intentionally or not, to annihilate Limbo's usability. I have been the primary glazer of Limbo and his reputation in the community. Although, it does not mean I cannot see the flaws in his kit, or his interactions with the sandbox we reside in. Limbo's Rift already has anti-synergistic properties with other frames, as shown with my Lord and Savior Station Prime, requiring Rift displacement to interact with any of Limbo's mechanics, and this is worsened by the multitude of frame abilities that still become hampered by this mechanic. Ember's Fire Blast and Gara's Splinter Storm being the most notable examples of this oversight, requiring casting on the same plane in order to damage said enemies, Mirage's clones being another outlier in this mess, and a multitude of others that require patches as soon as possible, or else they will be further forgotten by digital extremes. This extending to enemy-to-player interactions. Some enemy attacks that clearly should not bypass the Rift can occur, the Thrax units being a clear-cut case. The melee lunge attack of the melee Thrax units are counted as an ability, despite clearly not being one. While the triple magnetic lasers are not counted as an ability, despite them clearly being so. Or Archon Naira, her whip's projectile is counted as an ability, despite it clearly coming from a melee weapon, making Limbo completely unusable against her without quick thinking tech to compensate. With the Murmur furthering this issue, for several attacks from them can bypass the Rift, the self-destruct mechanic, the magnetic blast, and the laser from the snakes being the most prevalent, causing great distress from a few of the Limbo mains I have spoken to. For the lack of changes or buffs to these issues makes one wonder what the future could hold for the Riftwalker, if more of these issues become more common down the line, with the most despicable of these problems being the operator themselves. The operator cannot be in the Rift, and by this logic the amp they carry, so important abilities exclusive to the operator, in this case Last Gasp, is unusable. For if every enemy is in the Rift upon being downed, Limbo cannot release them from the Rift, forcing Limbo to play around with base or negative range setups so as to reduce the amount of enemies that are in and out of the Rift at all times. And there are very niche cases where this can be helpful, like the Eidolon hunts. The Eidolon cannot be in the Rift, nor can the operator, plain and simple. All of these flaws need correction by DE if they revisit him, for if not, then Limbo may cause or be the victim of unforeseen events down Warframe's conflicting grey path. A path where Limbo himself may be abandoned on. This, in combination with misinformation at the hands of creators, has festered and spread a plague within the community, one that has remained for nearly a decade, resulting in Limbo being a mistake of DE's creation, at least in the eyes of the player base, when he isn't nearly as intrusive or weak as perpetuated by his haters. But I digress. Limbo still requires some tune-ups. Quality of life is necessary for Limbo in today's sandbox, for despite his strength, even legends need aid in dark times. To understand what must be nurtured, one must understand what external factors are necessary to empower, yet restrict, a frame. And it's an element that has been slowly dying over the game's lifespan, with the Warframe nukes being a cancer of DE's making. Warframe kit design has evolved drastically over the years, with Limbo coming from an age of class systems. Frames that were not one-man armies, but needed a friend or entire squads to maximize their potential, with frames carefully crafted to have nuanced or glaring flaws to overcome. Terran, as explored previously, is an example of the glass cannon, a frame built entirely for maximizing DPS, with low defenses to offset this, and requiring careful management of her spores to compensate. The aforementioned Trinity is a clear example of this support, having abilities tailored towards damage reduction and healing, with other utilities to maximize these effects, with Limbo being a unique case of a frame fitting a jack-of-all-trades. Defensive/survivability features being baked into his kit, with DPS not being available through his abilities directly, with only coming in the form of his augment Rift Torrent. There was a clear balance in options during these past times, until somewhere down the line, something changed within this philosophy, leading the frames moving away from these cooperative aspects towards one-man nukes that have everything they need to sustain themselves, with concepts like crowd control and healing rotting away due to DE's incompetence, and bastardization of mechanics like Overguard.
Enemies were too easy to shut down without Overguard, being CC'd so hard you would never notice their new special attacks. So Overguard was put in place to prevent this until you had actually engaged in combat with the enemy, forcing you to deal with their abilities. Enter the Bolstered Belligerence debuff, which grants all enemy units in the mission 50% of their max health as Overguard,
forcing players to adopt one playstyle and only one playstyle. This issue coming into full force with one frame. The frame that, to me, exemplifies everything wrong with Warframe's kit design. Dante. To understand why Dante is, in my opinion of course, Warframe's most problematic frame, let us look at the other Warframes around him, and how they function and interact with the game's sandbox in a balanced manner. Every Warframe's kit can be categorized in two ways, synergistic or non-synergistic, with 4 subcategories or aspects that every frame can have, those being damage, of which damage amping powers count, crowd control, survivability or defense-focused utilities, and lastly, sustainability. Saren has the damage output of her spores, with light CC coming with the spores in the form of the Spore Stagger, and easy sustainability due to how easily she can kill enemies to get energy back, but lacked consistent survivability due to low armor and HP, and even though having an aggro tool in the form of her molt, it's not enough to keep the heat off of her at all times. Loki is the opposite of this, having excellent crowd control, sustainability, and survivability, with the decoy disarm combo redirecting enemy flow on tile sets, with invisibility and switch teleport aiding in survivability and enemy redirection, with his true weak point being high DPS or damage amplification. This isn't to say later frames have all of these aspects either. In fact, if you can lack too many of these elements, Gyre, before the Abyss of Dagoth update, was severely lacking, having solid damage output and sustainability, but awful survivability and mediocre crowd control, which didn't help with her survivability either, with the damage being amplified by her Band-Aid augment Cathoid Current, and survivability being fixed by a subzoom from another frame. Something that should never happen for any frame, for that screams awful kit design if a subzoom is mandatory for a frame to even function. But with the Abyss of Dagoth shield gate changes, bond mods, and now enemy health nerfs from Jade Shadows, she is more than capable in today's Warframe. For the problems with her kit were indirectly fixed via changing in-game mechanics. And on the topic of Jade Shadows, let's talk about Jade herself, a frame that I genuinely love and enjoy. As far as supports go, she is stellar, having a solid healing tool, squad-wide buffs, a limited armor strip, crowd control and ranged revive tool, and an ultimate that aids in DPS and her survivability through damage reduction. But the difference between lacking these aspects back then in comparison to the present is how overwhelming damage has become, and moving missions away from cooperation focus, and most importantly, the removal of delayed gratification.
They felt like Kullervo, Daggett, and Corvex felt samey because they all have the same mechanics of kill enemies in a line. And while I don't think these are all the same character necessarily, I hate to say I kind of agree. And tell me, who was the last CC-focused frame we got? Not just one with a single CC ability, but one where it's a major part of their kit.
Damage in the old days of Warframe was difficult to maximize, forcing players to work for bigger numbers, and with the old enemy scaling was a real challenge to overcome, but as the years progressed, the enemies continued to get weaker and weaker, where now at Jade Shadows, enemies are now at their lowest point in terms of power scaling. In order to obtain any sort of challenge, one must brave missions like Void Cascade for nearly an hour, to encounter any sort of friction, for enemy damage reaches the point where you will always get one shot if you are not careful, with the Warframes following suit, making it easier and faster to nuke tile sets in comparison to before, with Dante trivializing all of this. Noctua has absurd base damage, with it being slash on top of that. Light Verse gives Overguard, where when casted twice and casting his ultimate grants Overguard regen. Dark Verse projects slash to enemies in range, and with 2 of these casts can activate Tragedy, a slash AoE with a ridiculous base range of 30 meters. With this damage taken further with Page Flight, summoning owls that increase status chance and damage to enemies attacked by the owls, and Word Warden spawning a copy of Noctua to fight with the player. These are very basic explanations of Dante's abilities, and if I wanted to talk about it more, it would add an extra hour. But from value, one can already see that his entire kit is built around DPS and maximizing damage in an AoE. This in of itself isn't an inherently bad thing, especially after DE introduced line of sight to his ultimate. The real issue is actually Light Verse and Triumph. Overguard is a very strong defense type in early game, with its effects dwindling the further in level you go. But with these abilities easily granting this defense type in AoEs, it creates an issue where both his survivability and nuke potential are covered. No build up, no effort. Simply tap the button and keep on going, with these ability ranges already being sufficient enough, where the only stat Dante needs is strength. Dante doesn't require effort to make himself perform, removing any desire from the player to experiment with his stats, and not having any consequences for improper modding or misinputs from the player, since every ability is beneficial to use and has no downsides to the user. Dante is by design an overpowered frame because he has no weakness to fix via player modding or skill. The power is just there for the taking, and as a result of his much needed nerfs and lack of build variety, it has led to Dante's reputation dead in the water. The worst part being potential synergies or experimentation being left behind by the player base for the next big thing. But Sci-Fi, you openly said you loved Jade, and she is a nuke frame too, right? Well, first off, no, she isn't. And second, her nuking potential can be potent under the right conditions and tools used. But it is nothing in comparison to Dante for the same reason a frame like Corvex is potent. The nukes are determined by enemy density and actually having enemies on the field to activate the AoEs, since the nukes are tied to status effects common to or exclusive to the frames. For Jade, it's the judgment status, while with Corvex, it's radiation status. While with one-button nukes like Equinox, she requires kills within the main aura in order to build up the main damage before it can be unleashed. Dante has none of these restrictions, for his nuke isn't determined by enemy density and is oriented on himself, and due to his tragedy functioning similar to Expedite Suffering, in that it takes DOTs on enemies and applies their tick damage in a single instance, it makes an already strong ability even stronger. With Overguard outright making Dante invincible, due to Tribute's Overguard regen working even if he loses it, allowing him to repeatedly activate the Overguard gate. By comparison, Jade's shield recharge delay is halted if shields are broken, making Jade's survivability hindered if aggro isn't properly managed, thus making Jade function best in a squad, with Jade empowering her allies, whilst that allies keep enemy fire off of Jade. It's this balancing act that Dante lacks, and because of it makes Dante hollow in comparison to the Warframes that came before him, a Swiss Army knife that gets the job done, but not in a way that is interesting or balanced. Balance being the key point here, for most don't realize that game balance is necessary even in a PvE setting. For without game balance, you run the risk of creating something that everyone will flock to, due to the efficiency of said method and ease of use. AoE weapons like the Brahma were the meta staples of Warframe for this reason. High damage, AoE, ammo, and relatively easy to get, with very low investment, leading to a mindset of, why would I use this, in comparison to everything else. With the most depressing aspect being, even non-AoE nuke frames can easily keep up these kills or mission parameters without them. Nukes are just overkill, and provide an easy solution to a problem, when the mission only needs you to follow set parameters in order to succeed. Limbo may not have a nuke, but with enough knowledge can keep up a high enough kill rate without failing the mission. Loki falls under this same category. Through manipulation of enemy placement, he is capable of making any mission easy, while keeping up the kill rates through bringing the enemies to himself. And this doesn't just apply to synergy-focused utility frames. Members of Warframe's old guard have this as well. Trinity has little to no synergies, and is capable of blasting through any mission due to the potency of her supports, and her weapons being her sole means of DPS. With the greatest example of this being Rhino, a frame with abilities that work alone, but together make him a formidable utility tank. But due to my limited experience with Rhino, I employed a member of the Rhino Council, Animalistic, to explore Rhino and his kit.
Hi, I am Animalistic. Some of you probably knew me as that Rhino main, but anyways, I am here to provide some basic explanation about him, and how even though his kit doesn't have any real synergies, they still work amazingly together, providing utility, support, tanking, and damage when combined, forming a team that symbolizes him instead of showing those synergies up front. And so, what is Rhino? To start, let's have some brief explanation on Rhino's base kit. Rhino Charge is an ability that provides Rhino the movement he needs to make him blitz through mission, but very often that this ability is widely underused, misunderstanding the correct method of using it. Not talking about Ironclad Charge, but the base ability itself. A lot of you use it like this, but not like this. And as you can see, the speed difference is massive. This is a technique called bullet jump cancel, which you will cancel your bullet jump with Rhino Charge. And due to Rhino Charge carries your current momentum in a way unlike others, you dash with further range and more control over your dashes. Rhino Charge is simple but deep. Though this is just a basic rundown, should provide you ample information for later. Iron Skin is Rhino's most well-known ability, but not something that makes Rhino like what he is now. Iron Skin provides Rhino a short 3-second period of invulnerability, and in this period, Rhino will absorb any forms of damage and transforms it into his skin. There is also a formula of Iron Skin, which is 2.5 times total armor value times power strength, but enemy damage scaling is just too good of a scaling. The only thing you need to learn is literally pure skill and understanding. But why pure skill and understanding and not other things? I will explain all this later. Raw is also very well known, multiplicative damage for himself and allies. Raw provides Rhino the damage he needs and can increase his kill speed. This ability, when well used, provides Rhino all the offensive he needs, and even extremely strong defensive and some offensive purpose when piercing Raw is introduced. Rhino Storm is Rhino's 4th ability and also Rhino's most important ability. Rhino Storm is a base 25 meter CC that makes his enemies tumble in the air and slow by 97.5%. The slow percentage is unaffected by mods. 97.5% means that Rhino Storm possesses twice the slow power than any ability that has 95% slow, notably Gloom or Weird Sight when max. Sounds simple, right? After some brief explanation, let's just talk about the extremely subtle synergy between Rhino's abilities. Rhino is seen to have 4 utterly standalone abilities, but they all work together to form a very specific synergy. Unlike others who just show their synergies upfront, Rhino doesn't tell you immediately. Rhino Charge is that very naughty baby that likes to move around. He likes to cause everyone to move with him and just serve to help evade firepower or to advance or move quickly. His carelessness, no big deal. Iron Skin is like your spoiled, very talented young little brother that wants a lot of help, but he is destined to be extremely overpowered when you can cover his shortcomings from the likes of Raw, Piercing Raw, Rhino Storm, and Reinforcing Storm. Raw increases your kill speed massively. Rhino Storm makes almost everything not hitting you. Piercing Raw makes everything deals 80% less damage, and Reinforcing Storm replenishes 4% of max skin health per enemy hit until your skin HP is max again. Raw is like that middle child who is humble and is secretly good at a lot of things. He is the child who likes to be offensive and defensive if he is tasked to, but his aggression often needs someone to cover for him. The reason why I said Rhino Storm is the strongest ability in his kit is that he is the kind big brother of the four. He is extremely reliable, strong, and bulky, can work alone. He doesn't need Iron Skin or Raw to even work fantastically. But as a big brother, he is there to help his little brothers. If anything fails, you can always sure that Rhino Storm is always the last resort. But this doesn't mean he doesn't need help. His little brothers can provide the support he needs, and he will provide the cover they need. Rhino's base kit is like siblings. They alone have weaknesses, but they work together to complement and elevate each other, to do one job together to become what Rhino is. It is a form of synergy that doesn't tell you straight up, but a kit designed to let them work with each other. They alone are not perfect, but together they are perfect for each other. This means that taking away any abilities from Rhino comes with clear downsides. The correct choice of replacing his wand with other abilities will make Rhino lose his speed and the power to advance quick, making him significantly slower. Even if you use something like Thermal Thunder, you still lose the speed to make the rest of his kit shine better, despite gaining more power and the ability to nuke without weapons. Even if Rhino has the strongest and the most synergy with the helmet system, Rhino's base kit is always better for a lot of cases. Trading speed away for power is nice, but sometimes move faster is always better, and it makes Rhino fast instead of slow. And that is all from me. Hope you all learned something new in this video, not just mine, but the entire video you are watching right now. I will pass the mic back to Sci-Fi or whoever is the next. Adios.
Rhino is a staple of Warframe, who hasn't aged one bit over the years, with a defensive crowd control kit no less. Nukes are simply a cop-out for players who do not wish to put in the effort to learn. As mentioned earlier, this isn't inherently a bad thing. It's the fact that these frames have oversaturated the arsenal that becomes problematic. Simply reworking a frame into a nuke, or a typical weapons platform, will further oversaturate the sandbox, to the point all frames will lack an identity. In fact, reworking frames in this manner can lead to more harm to the frame than good, Hydroid being the latest victim of this treatment. Hydroid before his rework was undoubtedly flawed, and the prospect of an updated kit was on many people's minds. But what Hydroid did have was a unique synergized kit surrounding his puddle. Hydroid's kit reflected a Davy Jones-esque style in his visuals and kit design, dragging enemies down to the deep depths in slick fashion.
And how his tentacles now move to be where his range is at all times and grab new enemies. Because instead of being a place and forget where you could strategically know where 20 enemies is and spread the tentacles spread in a single point, it's now going to be spread all over the place and holding them in very not good areas of doors. And you could do this easily at the safety of your own puddle, because the puddle was the easiest way of being survivability-wise.
So by that, would you argue that by removing puddle, it kind of removed a lot of what made Hydroid in a way? Like his uniqueness?
For some players. For most players, I would say yes. Most of the mains, at least.
Mm-hmm.
And they clearly made everything else better. It's just they removed the entirety of puddle, which made him way less comfortable.
The one thing that tied Hydroid's kit and theme together was cut out, turning him from a crowd control casting strategizer into a stereotypical weapons platform, casting abilities at random with no need to think, effectively turning Hydroid into something he never was, and never meant to be, driving away his most diehard fans in the process. This isn't to say DE will do the same to Limbo, but it still should be on people's minds. Warframe is a sandbox, but if every frame, weapon, and tool is the same, at what point does it stop being one? And if Limbo is changed to fit that mold, is he even Limbo anymore? A Limbo Rework is a tad disingenuous to call an update, for Limbo's kit, as established, works just fine, if a bit too well depending on the mission in question, for Limbo has the tools necessary to breeze through any mission type, so long as the user has adequate knowledge of the game. Limbo being Steel Path viable in a modless state is evidence enough. However, after careful discussion with those on the Limbo Council, Dark, Jim, and Cadaverous, we realize that there are several points of contention that need improvement in his revisitation, without sacrificing his core theme, and without turning him into a meta staple. Limbo's abilities and mechanics by themselves are already very strong, but he does have checks that are largely unnecessary, and Limbo needs more, a lot more, if he is to survive the future Warframe is shaping up to be. So, there will be many concepts in store, but not all of these can be implemented. We only ask that they be considered. Let's begin with changes to his passive, and an update that is necessary above all else: VFX changes. Limbo's VFX are nearly unnoticeable to the naked eye, and yes, the Rift filter and shimmer are there as indicators, but it's not something players will point out on a first glance, unless one enters autistic levels of detail and study like myself, with the VFX changes taking inspiration from Duviri's color grading, with its black and white system. While enemies and allies are in the Rift, they take on this color grading. To Limbo and allies or enemies in the Rift will be black and white, with the world being black and white while being in the Rift, but retaining their original colors while inside. This black and white won't obstruct enemy Eximus auras or ability colors, with an additional aura surrounding the enemy taking inspiration from the Spore, Shardbane, Asperius Tier 1, and Frostfall Ephemeras, matching Limbo's default energy colors and not affected by customization, removing the ability for Limbo to troll, since enemies can be easily distinguishable. But if it's too much of a hassle to implement the black and white system, at least add the aura. This alone would improve Limbo's reputation massively, for allies won't be confused as to why enemies aren't being damaged, since an enemy is distinctly marked. Now, if DE wanted to lean into the magician or comedic side of Limbo, give rifted enemies phantom top hats mirroring the skin equipped to Limbo, also matching the default energy colors and not being changeable. It would be a distinct marker and add more charm to Limbo. Onto Limbo's rift itself. The bugs and rift piercing attacks from enemies need to go. It causes too much of a headache for the players learning him, and actively de-incentivizes players to pick him up. At least everything except Eximus abilities and boss abilities need to be changed. For it is intended for gameplay balance, but when Limbo has maybe 2 to 3 options for rift piercing, versus the dozens of enemies that counteract his invincibility, it makes a gameplay loop already against the player more sour, even if this means patching out the rift piercing tech that already exists. Furthermore, to lean into Limbo killing himself by entering the rift, a new status effect exclusive to Limbo called Volatility should be introduced. Volatility is a status effect that all enemies including Eximus gain upon entering the rift that works as follows. Enemies that enter the rift will begin to destabilize, taking void damage equal to 1% of the target's max HP. This bonus is doubled on enemies affected by rift surge. Void damage logically makes sense because Limbo's powers are said to be powered by the void, and this helps Limbo deal with enemies in the rift faster, without it being overtuned for void damage still has to contend with armor and shield reduction, giving Limbo a form of damage scaling that isn't affected by mods, for it's not meant to turn him into a DPS caster, but help him in scaling content, especially against enemy Eximus units, since Volatility must go through the Overguard first. Providing a form of Overguard erosion to Limbo, and creating a counter to Eximus should DE keep Eximus abilities as is. This is just his passive. His abilities also need a few additions. Banish can largely remain as is, but a preferred change would be to convert it to an AoE similar to Rest from Equinox. That way the ability has more control, and possibly allowing it to be casted through the rift like the original Limbo, with its AoE being small, 5 to 6 meters at most, to keep the ability from being too overbearing, and swallowing whole tile sets unless with very high range, with the Augment Rift Haven being changed to apply to Limbo himself, but reduced from 25% to 10%, since having it too high would make Limbo immortal even to Eximus units near the thousands. Moving on to Stasis, with the most important change to the ability: cross-dimensional damage. While Stasis is active, the fabric of reality begins to tear, causing both planes to have limited contact. Allies in Limbo's attacks cross into the rift plane, but only at 25% effectiveness. Now the reason why the percentage is so low is to maintain effectiveness at lower level content, without it being too strong in the thousands. Players generally do more than enough damage to exterminate enemies in the lower steel path, generally in 1 to 2 hits. Say 1 million damage is the average among most players. Enemy HP is on average, say, 50,000, with the armor DR being capped at 90%, bringing that effective hit point value to 500,000. Players with the partial rift piercing damage will be brought down to 250,000. Now it takes 2 hits to kill. With armor removed, it becomes 1 hit again. Obviously this isn't accurate values, but it gets the point across. The player base with proper modding knowledge are not going to notice this issue unless they are considering a level cap, in which case this does become a point of contention, with full damage only applying when the player is on the same plane as the enemy they are attacking, but providing some kind of workaround without completely breaking the rift mechanic, and further removes the effects of trolling, for it's tied to Limbo survivability. The user cannot cause problems without endangering themselves in the process. Rift Surge only needs one change to its functionality, that being the Surge Jump. To add more consistency, make this jump move to the enemy closest to the enemy slain, instead of a random target, adding a greater sense of control by eliminating RNG within Limbo's kit. Possible changes could include increasing the Banish AoE from 5 meters to 6 or 7, and tying the Surge application radius to Limbo's affinity range, but I digress. Consistency is key in a Warframe's kit, and it's necessary in Limbo above all others. Rift Torrent is where things get a little difficult to justify. On the one hand, it realistically should be a base kit addition, but as my friend Dark has reiterated constantly, it's an addition worth the mod slot it takes up, for that slot could easily be replaced with additional strength mods like Blind Rage, and easier to offset due to the user having all 8 mod slots instead of the usual 7. So if it is made into a base kit addition, its bonus needs to be lowered to compensate. 20 to 25% would be best. Also, the bonus can be shared with allies if they are in the rift, even if it's only half of the bonus. Lastly, when allies or Limbo exit the rift, they keep the bonus for a short period of time, say 5 seconds at base. That way Limbo is able to deal with unriftable foes in a comfortable manner, should DE decide to keep them the way they are right now. And now, Cataclysm. Reduce its base range from 16 meters to 12 meters. Cataclysm's radius is simply too high for Riot Bubble builds specifically, and by reducing the rift coverage, makes it easier for allied players to play with Limbo, since there's less of a rifted map to contend with. But this second proposal I'm far more iffy on, allowing enemies and allies to shoot in and out of Cataclysm. Cataclysm functions as the best defensive tool in the game, turning any defense-focused mission into a joke via its aura functionality. But if it were overhauled into a true portal, that use would end. Allies inside the bubble would be given 100% cross-plane damage in hindsight, while granting protection to allies, Limbo, and stationary defense targets. But by this logic, enemies would have the same rules, shooting into the Cataclysm and hitting the target on the inside, only being stopped via Stasis. But that's where the problem lies, the Stasis projectile cap. Stasis's projectile cap is 300 before it breaks, as mentioned in the Stasis segment, and for one enemy shooting into the rift, it isn't an issue for Limbo to concern himself with. But when it's 20, upwards of 30 enemies firing into this portal, that cap is going to be hit very quickly. Logically, it would function how it does now for enemies, but I would not be surprised if DE made it function 1-to-1, even if it's just for consistency. On top of this, it would kill synergies with Banish and Rift Surge, for rifted enemies outside Cataclysm would no longer be interactable, for the bullet would be leaving the rift, with surged enemies exiting Cataclysm and banishing nearby non-surged enemies in the process, exacerbating this issue. The only way to alleviate this being to remove the shrinking of Cataclysm and make it a static sphere, but this would again kill the previous synergies. This is an interesting buff that comes with its own hindrances that I'm going to leave the DE themselves to solve. Moving on. The Nullifier's interactions with Cataclysm need to be changed. That is no surprise to those familiar with Limbo. Nullifiers should be changed, or when they interact with Cataclysm, The rate at which it shrinks increases by 1 second, this being per nullifier interacting with the sphere. It would allow Limbo to play around nullifiers without outright forcing the user to play with one single build or specific weapons, but still put pressure on Limbo to take them out, since they still remain a threat. With the final update to his base kit, Cataclysmic Continuum's functionality should be made base kit. It's a good mod to have, but it's not worth it over the mods that could be placed there. This would free up space for future augments, like one that stops Cataclysm from shrinking, something that isn't what the players are currently cursed with. That, however, isn't the end of it. Limbo's kit is designed more so for solo play, in that his abilities focus entirely on getting enemies across planes, something that a Limbo player isn't going to be doing often in a squad, especially with other nukes. Proposal: adding additional abilities to his kit in the form of hold casts. Banish itself has one to remove all enemies from the Rift. Stasis, Rift Surge, and Cataclysm simply activate their tap functions again. By introducing extra abilities to its loop, it can remove problems that some companions solve, allowing room for more interesting builds and giving him something to do when he can't have enemies in his dimension, with the first of these being the Rift Anchor. Rift Anchor will be the hold function of Stasis, and operates as a cross-dimensional support tool to benefit himself and allies. On cast, Limbo twirls his top hat and drops it on the field, levitating in place. The hat will release an aura that expands into a larger radius. Within this radius, the physical and rift planes merge. Upon exiting this field, allies in Limbo retain partial non-corporealness, allowing for both planes to interact at highly reduced effectiveness. The ability itself will cost 50 energy, with the initial radius of the aura being 5 meters, with the aura expanding outward at 1 meter per second for 5 seconds. The initial radius is affected by range mods, but the expansion rate and duration of the expansion are affected by duration mods. The cross rift damage within the aura is 50%, but if the ally attacks an enemy outside of the aura, it becomes 25%. And the same is true for enemies in the aura, if the ally is outside of the aura, with this damage not being affected by mods, but the 25% damage reduction does stack with Stasis's, allowing for 50% damage across planes. This of course being if enemies and allies are on opposing planes. If they are on the same plane, it is 100% effectiveness. Upon exiting this field, allies keep the aura for a base 5 seconds, during which they keep the 25% cross rift damage as before, and gain temporary rift access, dodging in and out of the rift at will, with this aura affecting boss type enemies and unriftable foes, granting a means of dealing with said foes without placing them in the rift directly. With a possible synergy being the ability to surge the top hat, and upon detonation, all enemies in the aura radius become rift-bound. Rift Anchor has no duration, and will only end once Limbo recalls it by holding the ability once again. This ability alone would shift Limbo's dynamic drastically, turning from a unique crowd control frame that has a mechanic unique to himself, to one that can temporarily grant allies access to it, and additional benefits like 25% effectiveness against enemies outside of the rift plane, if the ally or Limbo is in the rift at that time, gaining near immunity at the cost of damage dealt. But as cool as this ability is, DE is highly unlikely to implement something of this nature, for it could easily break Limbo's balance in the game, if overtuned. So more realistically, here is the alternative. Limbo twirls his top hat and throws it out on the field. The hat saves Limbo's state within the rift dimension. Upon death, Limbo is revived with some of his max HP, with the anchor entering a cooldown. Kills while the ability is active reduces this duration. The anchor itself has an unlimited duration like before, but has a few caveats. It can only be casted while in the rift dimension, with the revival only happening in the rift plane. The max HP regained is 25% and does scale with strength mods. The cooldown after the revive is 45 seconds, with each kill reducing this timer by 0.1 second. 0.2 seconds if the kill is in the rift, but only during the time before the cooldown is triggered. This anchor would fix survivability outside of the rift, a free revive that can be recasted frequently, so long as the kill threshold is reached, with this revive being suited to general play and some boss encounters, but not something easily accessible at higher levels, and it would fit with Limbo's magician nature, pulling a no U on the enemy. Then we come to the hold cast of Rift Surge, and the two possible versions of Rift Distortion. On cast, Limbo aims down the reticle, and after release, coats a group of enemies in void energy that lasts for a short duration. When the energy decays, the void coating unleashes a small portion of whatever damage is taken to enemies nearby, with this bonus increasing on rifted enemies. And if enemies killed by the explosion are surged, the explosion damage is transferred into another AoE, equal to half of the Banish radius. This ability will cast similar to Banish, with a limited angle of 15 degrees, unaffected by mods, but the range being significantly lower at 10 meters. The converted damage in the explosion is 20%, with the explosion damage becoming void damage, with said damage being increased by 50% against rifted enemies. The explosion multiplier scales with strength mods, except for the bonus against rifted units. The AoE's base range is 6 meters, which scales with range mods, and the decay rate is 10 seconds, scaling with duration mods. Rift Distortion would give a limited DPS option that would work on both planes, while fitting with how he functions in lore. Done so without compromising his crowd control capabilities, since the damage is amplified significantly if the target is in the rift. It also satisfies the meta heads out there, by giving him an optional DPS power to make use of, not one to put him on par with frames like Saren or pre-nerf Dante, but one to help him make a difference. Unless the second version is implemented. On cast, Limbo draws his weapon and enters a duelist stance. While aiming, Limbo can highlight all rifted and non-rifted enemies on the map, teleporting to a single enemy at an infinite distance in the rift, mimicking the enemy's current state. Upon landing, he unleashes a single attack related to the weapon drawn, but the damage being boosted based on enemy density in the rift. After the act is complete, Limbo's movement speed is boosted, allowing for a quick escape. This ability costs 75 energy, with the range of the teleport without a target, or if the target is outside of the rift plane, being 15 meters at base. The damage bonus per enemy in the rift is a multiplicative bonus of 1%, and does scale with power strength, with the speed bonus after the attack being 15%, and scales with power strength as well, with said bonus lasting for 5 seconds, which scales with duration mods. This variation of Rift Distortion would lead into the more strategic side of Limbo's kit, acting as a movement tool to reach groups of enemies quickly, or to pick a beefy unit to drop, acting as an additional gateway between planes if a specific target is selected outside of the rift. However, it should be important to note that if either version of Rift Distortion is implemented, Rift Torrent would have to remain as the augment, for it would add a damage dealing power or weapon buff at the base kit. Having Torrent added on top of that would be way too strong as a base kit addition, so a slot must be sacrificed in return. To end the new ability Pipe Dream, we have Cataclysm's hold cast, Singularity. On cast, Limbo aims with the reticle at any surface he sees. When released, Limbo snaps his fingers and summons a swirl of void energy. Within an instant, the pocket of energy rapidly expands into Sort's reality. Once done expanding, it rapidly shrinks, teleporting all enemies both in and out of the rift to the center. Singularity costs 50 energy to cast, and the energy sphere starts at a base range of 1 meter, which is not affected by mods. The expansion rate is 5 meters per second for 2 seconds, which is affected by duration mods, ending at a 10 meter range, which is affected by range mods. Then it will collapse at a rate of 10 meters per second, this also affected by duration mods. However, non-rifted enemies are pulled in at half of the modded radius. Singularity acts as a grouping tool within Limbo's kit that he can cast at will, being quick and relatively cheap, acting as an ability to help Limbo get enemies within a closer vicinity, but having reduced effectiveness outside of the rift for balancing purposes, and gives him an ability to use when he can't operate in the rift. And with that, the hypothetical rework is realized. A rework that can turn Limbo into the ideal Warframe, a being of immense power and skill that when taken to the max is nigh unstoppable, but only when using every ability in tandem with each other. Players, old and new, will hopefully find these ideas pleasurable to the ears. But in the end, this is likely mute. DE have the final say, and they're probably not going to listen to some YouTuber rambling on the internet. Likely to not dilute pre-constructed plans, or to get into trouble, which I do not blame them. Regardless, should any of you gaze upon this video, I only ask that you consider them. Limbo is an enigma, a being hiding behind an ever-expanding arsenal, populated by copy-pasted kits and dying frames, simply because some big YouTuber made his opinion known. However, Limbo is something else. A crowd control frame that isn't what one typically imagines. A tank frame without a number value dictating it so. A god with access to the strongest weapon buff in the game, only having to sacrifice a single mod slot to make it so. If played poorly, he will perform poorly. If used intelligently, the ego is reflected and rewarded in a dance of interdimensional splendor. A ballet where you yourself dictate its outcome. A frame capable of world-ending power in an unmodded state. But these words are likely for naught. For I do not expect people to join me, not with the weight of responsibility that comes with it. In fact, I don't even expect many to reach this point, much less click on this video. Regardless, heed my words. I am a Limbo main. We mains are tenacious, enduring, and very stubborn. We do not give up quickly, and we do not take the easy way out. We are here, and we will remain. And should you follow in our footsteps, he is available after the Limbo Theorem. Until then, I am Sci-Fi Freak, the Schizo Limbo YouTuber. I may not be the first Limbo main, but I do intend to be the last. And I am the one who treads the path of the Riftwalker.